The talks between Russia and the U.S. on Ukraine and Saudi Arabia appear to have ended before they even began. They lasted just 5 hours.
Let's step back for a minute. This weekend, Secretary of State Rubio announced in Europe that talks to bring about peace would proceed without Ukraine at the table. This sent shockwaves throughout Europe and in Kyiv.
But after 4.5 hours, both sides agreed that it was an important first step. One aide told Politico that a summit between President Vladimir Putin and President Donald Trump is unlikely to take place next week, as still intensive work needs to be done.
Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, has said that any peace talks without his country's involvement won't bear fruit.
Here with us now to give us his assessment of this first meeting between Sergei Lavrov and Marco Rubio and what the future portends is retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure to be here, Robbie.
So I know there was a lot of outrage from mainstream media about Ukraine being supposedly left out of these negotiations. Of course, but my response to that was, well, but Zelenskyy has had every opportunity to speak to everyone in our government very regularly. Top political leaders from both parties. There's no shortage of communications on the Ukrainian side between us and them. What there hasn't been for 3 years, apparently, was any communications between the U.S. and the Russian side, which is necessary for peace, no?
100%. Yeah, there's no question about that. That's been one of the, in my view, one of the biggest failures of the previous administration is that their abject unwillingness. In fact, you even had Secretary of State Antony Blinken mock the idea of even talking to his counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. And if you're not talking to somebody, even if you hate them, then there's no possibility of finding any kind of possibility of common ground or any prospect of ending the war short of military confrontation on the ground. And as we certainly have come to conclude, there is no positive military outcome for the Ukraine side. The Western side tried everything in the world to do that short of sending its own troops in there. It failed. So then the only rational thing to do is to try to find a negotiated settlement, a diplomatic solution. And to do that, you have to talk to the other side.
You have to talk to the other side. Lieutenant Colonel, I think viewers at home would understand that it seems like it's a bit unusual not to have one of the parties to negotiation at the negotiating table. Could you give us a sense of how unusual this is or how common it is to have these kinds of conversations?
Yes, in one sense it is unusual, and it's certainly not intuitive. You would think that, of course, he would be at the table. But I have to say that I think that the Trump administration has concluded, because of the conversations that they have had with Zelenskyy, with some of the things he keeps saying in public, that they don't view him as a credible person with which to have negotiations, because you have Zelenskyy going on U.S. television, his own reporting that he comes out, his videos that he makes, and he's saying stuff like, I want nuclear weapons, I'm going to be in NATO, I'm not going to give up any territory. He literally said that 24 hours ago. And if you're telling the President of the United States that you won't accept any outcome that you don't approve, and he knows that all of the shots, as a matter of fact, Zelenskyy himself acknowledged in one of those interviews that he realizes that without the United States, they will lose quickly on the battlefield. With those power dynamics, then the idea that you should be at the table when you won't agree to any of the things that both the United States and Russia are agreeing to, then you would be an impediment to a negotiated settlement, not an agreement with it. And as unusual as it is, and as distasteful as I'm sure it is to many in Ukraine, if this is going to come to an end, it's going to have to really be between Russia and the United States first, and then Europe and Zelenskyy and everybody else second. Or, I'm telling you, here's the bad part, or the war will continue and eventually Russia will just seize by force of arms what it wants on the ground. That's the harsh reality that too few in the West acknowledge.
Yeah, I saw a poll yesterday that actually CNN discussed showing, increasing skepticism on the U.S. side among the U.S. people, actual voters, to continue supporting, unlimited financial assistance to Ukraine, the policy of the previous administration. Do you think Zelenskyy is he worrying that elections are going to be one of the sticking points in this negotiation? I know Russia said something to the effect that they want new elections in Ukraine that were suspended because of the war effort. Is Zelenskyy thinking about his own political future, rather than realistically focused on whether his country could possibly hold out in terms of the military effort?
Well, in my view, he has been disconnected from the combat reality for quite a long time now, because by all rights, this war should have been negotiated at an end in Istanbul in 2022. And then if they didn't want to do that, then it definitely should have been done after the 2023 offensive that the Ukraine side tried, where it was about a half a year's worth of attempts to break through the Russian side and force them out, an abject failure to even get through the first of 5 Russian defensive lines. That's when the Ukrainian leaders should have recognized reality and said, we have to get a negotiated settlement to save as much as we can. Instead, he continued prosecuting the war, and now then they are where they are. You had Secretary Rubio today in one of his comments specifically addressing that point you made. He said Trump is not interested in having a forever war and just continuing funding this war. It just ad nauseum, with no strategy, with no end state even in mind. And so I think that he's very clearly signaling this war is going to come to an end pretty soon, and it's going to be a negotiated settlement. And Zelenskyy will be forced then to either accede to that and to go accomplish whatever is agreed to by the two major powers, or he's going to be left on his own and he'll have to fight however he wants to. And that's, again, it's an ugly situation, but that's the reality.
So hearing your critique of the discussions or lack thereof to date over the past few years since the invasion in 2022, when would you say it is appropriate to bring Ukraine to the table, if not now?
I think as soon as Russia and the United States can come to some agreements on the important issues and the stickiest ones, which are where, what territory has to be exchanged, where the lines will be, and what the conditions will be afterwards. And those are still some really difficult situations, that there is still a big gap between what the U.S. and what the Russians want. And it's still is undetermined whether they're going to be able to close that gap, because if they can't, again, Russia has shown consistently throughout all 3 years of this, really you can go back even before the war started, that while negotiations are going on, they are going to continue with their military forces. And then our side is going to be left with, how far do you try to hold out before you get a deal if the conditions on the ground keep moving to the west, which is happening even as we speak today. So that's the real problem. And because until those are negotiated and discussed or agreed upon by the two sides, then there's nothing to even bring either Europe or Zelenskyy in on. So there's a lot of difficult work to go on there, and this could get worse.
Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Always my pleasure, Robbie. Thank you.
Up next, the cuts keep on coming. What's the latest target? We'll tell you. Stay tuned.